Hi, welcome to the self-study course based on my thesis entitled Level the Playing Field, Law Enforcement Policies and Practices Rigged Against Women and Mothers. This presentation is designed to assist Homeland Security and public safety professionals with information on how law enforcement agencies can modernize human resources policies and practices to improve the career paths of women in law enforcement in an effort to ensure retention. By the end of this presentation, you will understand my why and the importance of writing a thesis that allowed me to research why women and law enforcement might leave their chosen careers prematurely. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to recognize the need for improved practices in recruitment and retention. You'll be able to analyze the perception of an agency's gender equity efforts and the future of equity initiatives. And you would be able to provide strategies for changing and or adopting legislation and policies to make fair, equitable law enforcement environments a reality. My research looked at several different things. I looked at law enforcement culture, gender diversity in law enforcement. I looked at legislation and policies that impact women in law enforcement. And I also conducted a comparative analysis of the rules and roles of the women in the United States law enforcement. I compared those with women in the United Kingdom intelligence and security sector, as well as women in the United States military sector. And I also paid specific attention to maternity and motherhood in law enforcement. That I paid special attention to was law enforcement culture. Whether it's positive or negative, you cannot speak to why a woman would prematurely leave the career that she loves without talking about a law enforcement culture. I learned that culture is based on experiences. The research proved that the good old boys clubs and networks that began years ago still exist today. And research also proved that people are promoted and moved along in their careers, not necessarily based on what they know, but sometimes based on who they know. I also learned that the code of silences in law enforcement still exist. Those codes are what oftentimes keeps police officers quiet about misconducts when it comes to protecting his or her peers. The unfortunate part of the codes of conduct is that research shows that a lot of police women keep quiet about being victims in the vein of the code of silence. 49% of women in male-dominated workplaces have experienced some form of sexual harassment. That is a problem, but the codes of silence allow for women to keep quiet about being victims because they perceive the risks to their professions or their personal reputations as greater than the risk of telling or speaking out against anything that has or may have happened to them or someone they know. And of this section on law enforcement culture, I must repeat the fact that behaviors and actions of police officers are shaped by their experiences and also by their personal values. In order for women to stay in the jobs that they love, we must change the culture of law enforcement agencies. Now, the next thing my thesis spoke to was gender diversity and gender roles and policing. Most professions in this day and age reflect diversity. Unfortunately, in law enforcement, the profession is still primarily male-dominated. Women make up less than 14% of most police departments. Gender roles and diversity cannot be confused, though, with equality. Equality, especially in any career, but especially in law enforcement, affords fair competition. In law enforcement, we've already decided based on culture that there is not fair competition for the female officers. So there is no wonder that, unfortunately, women end up leaving those careers early. But in the essence of time, let's also remember that gender diversity is not just about women. Let's talk a little bit about the perception of motherhood versus fatherhood. Research shows that fatherhood in law enforcement is often applauded. And that's not just in law enforcement, that's in most or any career. While motherhood in law enforcement specifically comes with a certain type of negative stigma. Pregnant officers and mothers endure both structural and cultural barriers. Those barriers which men in law enforcement do not have to consider. A pregnant woman in law enforcement has to consider many things, even to the point of when they should tell their employer that they are pregnant. These are things that male officers never have to think about. And women also have to think about what happens during their pregnancy, how long will they stay on the job while they're pregnant, and they also have to think about the inherent risk to their unborn child and perhaps even themselves. So when you think about the perception between men and women in law enforcement and you factor in pregnancy and motherhood, then in law enforcement, it is very difficult to see and to realize that it's very hard for a woman to navigate those areas, especially without the support of her supervisors and her peers. Those things. Another thing I'd like to discuss about my thesis is the laws and regulations that came about over the years. If we're going to discuss women in law enforcement, we also have to discuss the actual laws that came about to make sure that women had equal rights within their law enforcement professions. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 spoke to specifically hiring practices. It prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Now, though, let's fast forward to the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, which then prohibited job discrimination. It prohibited it based on all those protected rights that I just spoke to. And so it said you cannot now discriminate upon a person based on their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, or you can be sued federally. So now let's fast forward to the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. In this act, departments cannot fire or force a woman out of her job due to pregnancy. This was a win-win for women in law enforcement. What it did was specifically allowed for a woman to keep her position, and it also allowed the pregnant officer, in conjunction with her doctor, of course, to decide when she was going to be able to no longer perform her duties, and also to decide when she would remove herself from those duties if she felt like her or her unborn child was in jeopardy of being hurt or harmed within that profession. It gave her the choice. The FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993, guaranteed employees 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And it also allowed employees to reinstate into their former positions after they returned from their leave. So that was also a win-win for women and men in law enforcement that opted to take leave and wanted to make sure that they could come back to the positions in which they left. Now, let's fast forward to the HR 1534. It is the Federal Employee Paid Leave Act, FEPLA. It guarantees 12 weeks of paid family leave and either for childbirth or adoption or care of a spouse or a parent. That is one of the very newest laws that came about while I was still writing my thesis and was actually implemented a year or so thereafter. So that's also a win-win for women in law enforcement who want to stay in their careers, and especially if you're in a federal sector where now you can get 12 weeks of paid family medical leave, and that's for the mother or the father. So I think the law enforcement agencies and just the government are moving in a right direction. And let's hope that some of the local law enforcement police departments will adopt a policy very similar to these so that they too can keep those officers like the federal agencies are. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that there are two essential facts that must be acknowledged in order for change to be realized. Number one, women and men are not the same. We must realize that before we can move on. Number two, there is still bias in law enforcement. So let's also acknowledge that my thesis and my research allowed us to understand and know that law enforcement agencies must address cultural and behavioral issues that have a negative effect on women in order to maintain their female law enforcement population. They must embrace gender diversity and they must talk about it. Both male and female leaders must resist and condemn any type of stereotypical attitudes that will force a female out of her chosen career. They must talk, discuss legislation and policies. There's a difference between knowing that rules exist and applying those rules without exception. Law enforcement agencies must do that in order to see a difference in their female population in order to retain those female officers and or agents or law enforcement personnel with any regard. They must also, law enforcement agencies must learn from other male populated professions on how they attract and retain female officers. Let's look to some other agencies, whether it's in the United States or other countries, on how are they attracting and retaining their female population so that we, the United States law enforcement agencies, can do the same things and adopt some of those same practices. And we must, as an agency and law enforcement leaders, get out of the building. Go talk to your employees, learn from them, learn what they want to know about their agency, learn the problems and issues that they may be going through but you don't know about because you are inside in your office. Get out there and talk to your people. That will certainly help you retain not just your female population, but also your male population. Lastly, I will leave you with a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. Thank you so much for looking at this video and taking my self-study course. I hope that you have learned a lot. My information is online, so please, if you have any questions, issues, suggestions, anything that can help me in my future research on this topic, please, by all means, reach out to me. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope that you have learned something from this video and from my presentation and my thesis. Thank you.